Funny how people only notice the floor collapsing when they're the ones standing on it. Yes. Victoria Hayes stared at the black credit card resting on the polished walnut table like it belonged to someone else. 30 seconds earlier, that same card could have bought half the wine cellar inside Bellamy's Steakhouse. Now the waiter beside her cleared his throat softly and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am." It declined again. The restaurant didn't go silent all at once. Silence moved slowly in places like Bellamy's. First came the lowered forks, then the side glances, then the whispers hidden behind crystal glasses and $1,000 watches. Manhattan knew her face. 3 months ago, Victoria Hayes had appeared on the cover of Forbes beside the words, "America's most ruthless female CEO." Tonight, someone at the bar quietly muttered, "Guess ruthless doesn't pay the bills anymore." A few people laughed into their drinks. Victoria didn't react. That was the strange thing about humiliation. The bigger it was, the quieter you became. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain crawled down the glass in crooked silver lines, blurring Park Avenue into a watercolor of headlights and cold reflections. Her phone buzzed again on the table. Another headline. Another betrayal. Hayes, global files for emergency restructuring. Board removes CEO after internal investigation. She flipped the phone face down. Her chest felt tight, but not from panic. Exhaustion. The kind that settled into your bones after too many nights pretending you still had control. "Ma'am," the restaurant manager said carefully as he approached her table, "I'm going to need another form of payment." Victoria looked up slowly. The manager recognized her immediately, but recognition in New York had an expiration date. Wealth bought respect. Losing it turned you into entertainment. "I owned 15% of this restaurant last year," she said quietly. "And last year's over," the manager replied with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. A couple near the bar looked over openly now. One man even lifted his phone slightly, pretending not to record. Victoria noticed it anyway. She noticed everything tonight. The cameras, the whispers, the relief in people's eyes now that the mighty woman had finally fallen. She reached for her purse, then stopped. Empty. Her driver had quit that afternoon. Her penthouse access had been frozen by evening. By 9 o'clock, even her assistant stopped answering texts. Funny how fast loyalty disappeared once stock prices dropped below $6 a share. "You can sit at my table." The voice came low and calm from beside her. Not loud enough to command the room, just steady enough to cut through it. Victoria turned. The man standing there wore a white waiter's shirt rolled neatly at the sleeves, black apron tied clean at the waist, tall, broad shoulders, dark skin, early 40s maybe. His name tag read Caleb. He held a tray in one hand like it weighed nothing at all. The manager frowned immediately. "Caleb, stay out of this." But Caleb didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Victoria, not with pity, not with curiosity, just quiet recognition, like he understood what it felt like to be cornered in public. "My shift ends in 10 minutes, he said evenly. "She can have my table until then. Company policy, then put it on my tab." The manager blinked. "You can't afford this place on a waiter's salary." Caleb finally looked at him. Calm, still, but something in his expression made the manager stop talking. Not anger, worse, discipline. The kind built somewhere hard, somewhere survival mattered more than pride. Victoria noticed it instantly. So did the room. Caleb pulled out the chair across from him near the back corner of the restaurant, away from the phones and whispers and eyes that suddenly smelled blood in the water. For a second, Victoria just stared at him. Nobody had stepped toward her all day. Everyone else had stepped away. Then Caleb spoke again, softer this time. "Ma'am," he said, "you look like you haven't eaten since yesterday." Something in her face cracked at that. Not dramatically, just enough for the exhaustion underneath to finally show. Victoria stared at the untouched bowl of lobster bisque Caleb had placed in front of her like it might ask something from her she could not give. Around them, Bellamy's Steakhouse slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Expensive laughter, crystal clinking, conversations disguised as business deals. But every few seconds, she still caught someone looking her way. Failure fascinated people almost as much as success. Caleb sat across from her without speaking. No questions. No awkward sympathy. Just a tall black man in a waiter uniform, quietly sipping black coffee that had probably gone cold 20 minutes ago. His silence felt strange in Manhattan. Most people used noise to prove they mattered. He did not seem interested in proving anything. You do this often? Victoria asked finally, her voice rough from exhaustion. Caleb glanced up slightly. Do what? Rescue rich strangers from public humiliation. One corner of his mouth moved almost into a smile. Almost, not usually. She let out a tired breath through her nose. Outside, rain hammered harder against the windows now, washing neon reflections across the sidewalk. Somewhere downtown, a siren echoed between buildings. New York never really slept. It just changed masks after midnight. Victoria picked up the spoon at last, though her hand trembled slightly. She hated that, hated weakness even more than pity. For 15 years, she had built herself into someone nobody could corner. Nobody could embarrass. Nobody could outmaneuver. Then one board meeting, one signature, one betrayal. That was all it took. Caleb watched her carefully for exactly 1 second before looking away again. He had the kind of awareness people carried after hard lives, the kind that noticed shaking hands without staring at them. You should eat while it is hot, he said quietly. Bad nights feel worse on an empty stomach. Victoria blinked at him. That sounds rehearsed. Single father, he replied simply. You learn things. Father. Something about the words softened the sharp edges in his voice. Victoria noticed the small wear marks on his sleeves now, the faint scar near his wrist, the posture too straight to belong to someone who had spent his whole life carrying plates. There was discipline in him, controlled, quiet, like a storm sitting far out at sea. Before she could ask another question, the front doors opened hard against the wind. 3 men in dark coats stepped inside carrying cameras. Reporters. Victoria's stomach dropped immediately. One of them spotted her near the back corner and pointed. There she is. The room shifted again. Heads turned openly this time. Phones lifted. Victoria pushed back from the table fast enough to rattle the silverware. Her breathing shortened. Not panic exactly. Worse. Exposure. She had spent all day being hunted through headlines and television segments like some cautionary tale for ambitious women. Miss Hayes, one reporter called while moving toward her. Is it true federal investigators froze your offshore accounts? Another voice followed. Did your fiancé testify against you? Caleb stood before she even realized he moved. Smooth, efficient, no wasted motion. Kitchen's this way, he said calmly. Victoria stared at him. What? Now. Something in his tone cut through the noise instantly. Not aggressive. Certain. He took off his apron while walking, draped it over one shoulder, and guided her through a side hallway near the service station. Behind them, camera shutters clicked like distant static. A young hostess tried blocking the reporters at the entrance, but New York gossip moved faster than security. Victoria's heels stumbled once against the tile floor. Caleb caught the swinging kitchen door before it slammed into her shoulder. Again, no wasted movement. Steam and heat swallowed them immediately inside the back kitchen. Cooks shouted over sizzling pans, while dishwashers rattled trays into sinks. The smell of garlic butter and grilled steak hung heavy in the air. Caleb kept moving. You military? Victoria asked suddenly, still breathless as they passed shelves stacked with supplies. Caleb did not answer right away. He pushed open the rear exit into the alley, where cold rain drifted sideways under the streetlight glow. Then he finally spoke. Used to be. Victoria looked at him carefully now. Really looked. The stillness made sense suddenly. The awareness. The way he read rooms before they changed. Army? She asked. Caleb shook his head once. Navy. Rain tapped softly against the metal dumpster. Beside them, somewhere nearby, traffic rolled through wet Manhattan streets in long, restless waves. Victoria wrapped her coat tighter around herself and realized something unsettling for the first time all night. Standing beside Caleb Brooks in a dark alley behind a steakhouse at nearly midnight felt safer than sitting inside a billion-dollar boardroom ever had. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Rain drifted through the narrow alley in silver streaks beneath the dim security light above the back door. Victoria could still hear the muffled noise of reporters somewhere near the front entrance, voices rising and falling like distant sirens. Caleb stood beside the service door with one hand resting loosely against the metal frame, watching the street instead of her. Alert, quiet, like a man who never fully relaxed in public spaces. You knew they were coming before I did, Victoria said softly. Caleb shrugged once. People move different when they smell blood. The sentence landed harder than she expected, maybe because it was true. Wall Street analysts, board members, investors, even people she once called friends. Everyone had circled the second her company started sinking. She wrapped her coat tighter against the cold wind cutting through the alley. Her heels suddenly felt ridiculous now. Sharp black designer heels standing in rainwater beside overflowing trash bins behind a steakhouse she could no longer afford. Life had a cruel sense of humor sometimes. Caleb glanced toward her shoes briefly. You are going to twist an ankle standing out here. You always this direct? Only when people are pretending they are fine, Victoria almost answered automatically. Almost told him she was fine the way powerful people always did. But the words would not come anymore. She was tired of performing strength for rooms full of strangers. I do not have anywhere to go, she admitted quietly. Saying it out loud made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Caleb looked at her then. Fully this time. Rain tapped softly against the shoulders of his white shirt, darkening the fabric. No hotel? He asked. Victoria gave a humorless laugh. My accounts are frozen by morning. My penthouse access ended at 8 o'clock, and apparently loyalty in Manhattan expires faster than milk. Caleb nodded slowly, like none of that surprised him. Maybe it did not. Men like him probably learned long ago that status could disappear overnight. A black SUV rolled past the alley entrance too slowly. Victoria stiffened immediately, Caleb noticed. Of course he noticed. He stepped slightly forward without making it obvious, casually shifting his body between her and the street. The movement was subtle enough most people would miss it. Victoria did not. You do that naturally, she said quietly. Do what? Protect exits. Watch reflections. Position yourself between people and problems. Caleb looked away again toward the rain-soaked street. Old habits. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked the screen quickly. Something softened in his face almost instantly. Everything okay? Victoria asked before she could stop herself. My daughter, he said. She wants to know if I remembered the strawberry pancakes. Victoria blinked at the sudden shift in tone. 1 second he looked like someone carved from stone. The next he sounded like a tired father heading home after a long shift. How old is she? 8. A faint smile touched his face now. Real this time. Think syrup counts as a vegetable if you believe hard enough. Victoria surprised herself by laughing softly. It was small, fragile. But it was the first real sound that had escaped her all day. Caleb noticed that too, though he politely pretended not to. Another gust of cold wind swept through the alley. Victoria rubbed her hands together, trying to hide the slight shaking in them. Exhaustion was settling deeper now, emotional exhaustion. The dangerous kind. Caleb studied her for one long second before speaking again. My apartment is in Queens, he said calmly. Victoria stared at him immediately. I am not asking for anything, he added before she could misunderstand. You can sleep on the couch. My daughter is there. You leave in the morning. That is all. Victoria looked down at the rainwater collecting near the curb. 24 hours ago, she had a private driver, a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and assistants who screened every phone call before it reached her. Now a waiter she met less than an hour ago was offering her the only safe place she had left. The strange part was not the offer. The strange part was that she trusted him. Not because she knew him, because she did not feel the need to impress him. Around Caleb Brooks, silence did not feel dangerous. It felt earned. He opened the passenger door of an older dark blue Ford Explorer, parked near the alley entrance. Clean interior. Child booster seat in the back. A tiny pink backpack resting beside it. Victoria stood there for another second watching rain slide across the windshield while Manhattan glowed cold and distant behind them. Then, slowly, quietly, she got in. The drive to Queens took 43 minutes in the rain. Victoria spent most of it staring through the passenger window while water blurred the city into streaks of gold and gray. They crossed the Queensboro Bridge in near silence, the Manhattan skyline shrinking behind them like something from another lifetime. Caleb drove with both hands steady on the wheel, eyes moving calmly between mirrors and traffic. No music played. No radio host screaming about politics or stock markets. Just the low hum of tires against wet pavement and the occasional swish of windshield wipers cutting through rain. Victoria realized halfway across the bridge that she could finally breathe again. Not completely, but enough. Her phone buzzed several more times inside her purse. She ignored every call. One message preview still flashed across the dark screen before fading. We need damage control by morning. Another said simply, call me before federal investigators do. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. Funny how the same people who toasted your success at rooftop parties suddenly spoke to you like a problem to manage. Caleb glanced toward her for half a second before returning his attention to the road. You should turn it off, he said quietly. The phone. Victoria looked down at it in her lap. I built my entire life around answering calls. How is that working out tonight? She almost smiled despite herself. Almost. Caleb exited the freeway and drove deeper into a quieter neighborhood, lined with brick apartment buildings and old corner stores glowing beneath faded signs. A laundromat still buzzed open near the intersection. A man in a Yankees cap swept rainwater away from the entrance of a deli. Life looked smaller here than Manhattan. Slower. Realer somehow. Caleb parked beside a three-story building with worn stone steps and narrow windows glowing warm against the rain. No doorman, no marble lobby. No security desk pretending wealth could stop loneliness from entering through the front door. Victoria stepped out carefully, heels clicking softly against wet pavement. Somewhere upstairs, faint music drifted through an open window. Old jazz, the kind played by people who still believed evenings should slow down after dark. Caleb grabbed a small grocery bag from the back seat before leading her upstairs. Third floor, apartment 3B. He unlocked the door quietly. The first thing Victoria noticed was the smell. Cinnamon, coffee, laundry detergent, home. Not the stage scent luxury condos pumped through hidden vents to impress buyers. This smelled lived in, safe. Caleb flicked on the kitchen light gently like he was trying not to wake someone. The apartment was small but clean. A soft gray couch sat beside a bookshelf overflowing with children's science magazines and dog-eared paperbacks. Crayon drawings covered one side of the refrigerator. One picture showed a stick figure in a superhero cape, holding hands with a smaller figure beneath uneven letters that read DAD. Victoria stood silently near the doorway, taking it all in. There was no designer furniture, no expensive artwork, but somehow the apartment felt warmer than her penthouse ever had. Caleb set the grocery bag on the counter and loosened his tie slightly. Bathroom is down the hall, he said quietly. Fresh towels are under the sink. Victoria nodded once. Her voice felt strangely distant tonight. Thank you. Caleb gave a small shrug like gratitude embarrassed him a little. You hungry? Not really. That usually means yes. He moved around the kitchen with calm efficiency, opening cabinets without noise, pulling out a kettle, setting mugs beside the stove. Every movement looked practiced, disciplined, like routine mattered here, like routine kept things together. Victoria noticed a framed photograph near the sink, Caleb in military uniform holding a little girl on his shoulders. Younger, smiling wider than she had seen tonight. Your daughter looks happy, she said softly. Caleb glanced toward the picture. Something gentle passed through his face again. Maya thinks pancakes solve most problems. Do they? Depends how much syrup you use. Victoria let out another quiet laugh before she could stop herself. It startled her a little. She had not laughed twice in one night in months. A small bedroom door cracked open down the hallway then. Tiny footsteps padded softly across hardwood floor. A little girl appeared, rubbing one eye sleepily while holding a stuffed rabbit against her chest. She blinked at Victoria in confusion first, then up at Caleb. Daddy? She whispered. Caleb's voice softened immediately. Hey, bug? Maya pointed sleepily toward Victoria. Who is that? Victoria suddenly felt awkward standing there in her soaked designer coat, inside this little apartment full of warmth she did not belong to. Caleb crouched slightly beside his daughter. Someone who had a hard day, he said gently. Maya looked at Victoria again for a long second. Then without hesitation, the little girl walked over and handed her the stuffed rabbit. You can borrow Mr. Buttons tonight, she whispered seriously. He helps when people are sad. Something inside Victoria Hayes cracked so quietly she almost did not feel it happen. Victoria did not remember falling asleep. One moment she sat curled beneath a soft blanket on Caleb's couch with Maya's stuffed rabbit resting in her lap. The next pale morning light spilled gently through the apartment windows, while the faint smell of coffee drifted through the air like a memory she had forgotten she missed. For a few quiet seconds, she simply lay there listening. No ringing phones, no market alerts, no assistants knocking on glass office doors with another emergency hidden behind professional smiles. just the soft scrape of a spatula against a pan and a child laughing somewhere nearby. The sound felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. Victoria sat up slowly. Her neck ached slightly from sleeping on the couch, but somehow it was the deepest sleep she had gotten in months, maybe years. The blanket slipped from her shoulders as she looked around the apartment again in daylight. Morning sunlight revealed little things the darkness hid last night. A pair of tiny sneakers beside the door, school papers taped neatly to the refrigerator, a cracked mug filled with sharpened pencils near the kitchen counter. Life lived carefully, intentionally. She stood quietly and followed the smell of coffee toward the kitchen. Caleb stood at the stove wearing a dark gray t-shirt and sweatpants, flipping pancakes with the same calm precision he seemed to do everything else with. Maya sat cross-legged at the small kitchen table, coloring on the back of what looked like one of Caleb's old restaurant schedules. Soft jazz played quietly from a radio near the sink. The apartment glowed warm beneath the morning light. Caleb glanced up first. "Morning?" His voice sounded rougher now. "Sleepy. Human." Victoria suddenly realized this was the first time she had seen him outside the waiter uniform. The military posture remained, though. Straight shoulders, controlled movements, awareness in his eyes even this early in the morning. "I should probably leave," she said automatically. Caleb slid another pancake onto a plate. "You have somewhere to be?" Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it again. Silence answered for her. Maya looked up from the table with serious concern. "You cannot leave before pancakes," she declared. "That is rude." Caleb hid a faint smile behind his coffee mug. Victoria surprised herself again by smiling back. Small moments. Strange how they could sneak past defenses entire boardrooms failed to break through. She moved toward the kitchen slowly. "Something smells good." "That means they are probably burning," Caleb replied calmly. "My dad only burns one side," Maya informed Victoria proudly. "That means he is improving." Caleb shook his head once like he had heard this speech before. Victoria sat carefully at the tiny kitchen table, while Maya pushed a bottle of syrup toward her with both hands. The scene felt almost unreal. 24 hours ago, Victoria Hayes had been discussing billion-dollar acquisitions inside a Manhattan skyscraper. This morning, she sat inside a Queens apartment, eating slightly burned pancakes beside a former Navy SEAL turned waiter and his 8-year-old daughter. And somehow this room felt more honest than every executive retreat she had attended combined. Caleb placed a plate in front of her without ceremony. Pancakes, eggs, black coffee. Simple food, real food. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb nodded once before, leaning against the kitchen counter with his own coffee. Maya studied Victoria carefully while coloring. "Daddy says people get quieter when they are sad," she announced suddenly. Victoria froze slightly. "Does he?" Maya nodded seriously. "After my mom left, Daddy got really quiet for a long time." Caleb's expression shifted almost invisibly. Not anger, just an old ache moving through familiar ground. "Maya," he said gently. "What?" "It is true." Victoria lowered her eyes toward the coffee mug, warming her hands. She understood quiet sadness. She had built entire years of her life around it. Caleb finally sat down across from her. "Kids notice things adults try hiding," he said softly. Victoria looked at him over the rim of her mug. "And what do adults notice?" Caleb held her gaze for one steady second. "When someone is carrying too much alone." The apartment fell quiet after that. Not uncomfortable quiet, safe quiet. Outside the kitchen window, Queens slowly woke beneath gray morning skies, while traffic hummed softly through distant streets. Inside apartment 3B, Victoria Hayes sat holding a chipped ceramic coffee mug between both hands and realized something that frightened her more than losing money ever had. She could not remember the last place that felt this peaceful. The morning moved slowly after breakfast, not lazy, gentle. Caleb washed dishes while Maya sat on the living room floor, building something complicated out of mismatched Lego pieces she kept insisting was a lunar research station. Victoria remained at the kitchen table longer than she intended, one hand curled around a second cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She kept expecting reality to crash back through the apartment door at any second. Lawyers, reporters, accusations. But inside apartment 3B, life kept moving in ordinary little rhythms that felt almost foreign to her now. Caleb dried a plate carefully before placing it into the cabinet. "You can borrow some clothes if you need," he said without looking over. "Maya's teacher left a box here last month for donations. Probably something comfortable in there." Victoria glanced down at her expensive cream-colored blouse, now wrinkled from sleeping on the couch. $2,200 worth of silk and tailoring. She had never felt less protected by clothing in her life. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb nodded once, like gratitude still made him uncomfortable. Maya suddenly gasped from the living room floor. "Daddy, you promised you would fix my backpack before school." Caleb looked toward the hallway clock immediately. "Right?" He set the dish towel aside and disappeared briefly into the bedroom. Victoria heard drawers opening softly before he returned, carrying a small sewing kit and a faded pink backpack, missing one strap. He sat at the edge of the couch and began repairing it with calm concentration, while Maya continued building rockets beside him. Victoria watched silently from the kitchen table. His hands moved differently now. Steady, precise, patient. The hands of someone trained for pressure yet careful enough to sew a child's backpack before school. Strange combination. "You were really Navy?" she asked finally. Caleb threaded the needle without looking up. "For 12 years, and now you wait tables. Now I raise a little girl." The answer came simple and direct. No bitterness, no shame. That unsettled Victoria more than arrogance ever could. She had spent most of her career surrounded by people obsessed with titles. Senior partner, executive director, founder, chairman. People introduced themselves like resumes. Caleb Brooks spoke like none of those things measured a person properly. Maya looked up suddenly. "Daddy used to jump out of airplanes." Victoria blinked once. Caleb sighed softly. "Maya, what? You did? At work?" Maya turned proudly back toward Victoria. "He says gravity builds character." Victoria laughed before she could stop herself. Caleb shook his head faintly. "I said falling teaches humility." "Same thing," Maya replied confidently. The apartment warmed with another small wave of laughter. Quiet, real. Victoria felt it settle somewhere deep inside her chest where tension had lived for years. Then her phone buzzed again across the kitchen counter. This time the sound felt louder somehow. Sharper. Caleb noticed the way her shoulders stiffened instantly. "You do not have to answer it," he said gently. Victoria stared at the screen lighting up beside the coffee mug. Richard Coleman, former fiancé, former chief financial officer, former everything. She turned the phone face down again. Caleb said nothing after that. He simply continued sewing the backpack while sunlight spilled softly across the apartment floor. No pressure, no curiosity. Just space. Victoria realized then how rare that was. Powerful people were constantly surrounded by people wanting access to something. Information, money, influence, favors. Caleb wanted nothing from her except honesty. The realization made her strangely emotional. She stood suddenly and moved toward the window before the feeling showed too clearly on her face. Outside, Queens carried on beneath cloudy morning skies. Delivery trucks, school buses, people holding coffee cups while rushing toward ordinary jobs. Life continuing without caring that Victoria Hayes had lost everything. Funny. She used to think the world paused for important people. Behind her, Caleb finally finished repairing the backpack and handed it back to Maya with a small nod. Good as new. Maya hugged him instantly around the neck before racing toward her room to get ready. Caleb watched her disappear down the hallway, with tired affection softening his face again. Victoria looked at him carefully from across the apartment. "You really love being her father." Caleb met her eyes for a long second. "It is the one thing in my life I never wanted to fail at, too." The words landed quietly between them, but Victoria felt them harder than any speech she had heard in a corporate boardroom. By 8:15, Maya stood near the apartment door, wearing a purple jacket 2 sizes too big, and the freshly repaired backpack hanging proudly from both shoulders. Caleb knelt in front of her, adjusting the crooked zipper, while she recited something about a science quiz with the seriousness of a military briefing. Victoria leaned quietly against the kitchen counter, watching them. The scene felt painfully ordinary, and somehow that made it beautiful. "Remember," Caleb said calmly while fixing the collar of Maya's jacket, "if somebody is mean today, what do you do?" Maya rolled her eyes dramatically. "Use my words, not my attitude. Good start. And if that does not work, walk away before small problems become big ones." Maya sighed like she had heard the lesson 1,000 times already. "You always say that," Caleb smiled faintly. "Because it keeps being true." He handed her lunchbox next. Simple blue plastic with faded stickers peeling from the sides. Victoria suddenly remembered a meeting 6 months ago where executives argued for 40 minutes over imported Italian espresso machines for one of the company offices. Strange what people called priorities depending on the size of their paycheck. Maya suddenly looked toward Victoria near the counter. Are you staying here today? Victoria hesitated. The honest answer embarrassed her. I do not really know yet. Maya considered that seriously for a moment. Then she nodded once like uncertainty was acceptable. Sometimes my dad does not know things either, she whispered confidentially. But he pretends less now. Caleb stood slowly, with one hand pressed briefly against his lower back. Old injuries, maybe. Victoria noticed the movement instantly. He caught her noticing too. Neither mentioned it. Come on, Bug, he said gently. Bus will be here in 4 minutes. Maya hurried toward the hallway before suddenly turning back around. She ran over and hugged Victoria without warning. Fast, tight, completely natural. Mr. Buttons works best if you hold him by the ears, she informed her seriously before releasing her. Then she disappeared out the apartment door, with Caleb following close behind. The apartment fell quiet immediately after they left. Not empty quiet, just still. Victoria remained standing beside the counter, listening to their footsteps fade down the hallway. Then silence settled across apartment, 3B again like soft snowfall. She exhaled slowly and looked around. Morning dishes drying beside the sink, a half-finished Lego rocket abandoned near the couch, a child's math worksheet sitting crookedly on the table. Evidence of people living honestly? Her phone buzzed again. This time she finally picked it up. 32 missed calls, 11 voicemails. Endless messages from attorneys, shareholders, media consultants, former friends suddenly concerned about their own reputations. One message stood apart from the rest. Richard Coleman. We need to talk before this gets worse. Victoria stared at the screen without blinking. Funny. Richard always spoke about disaster like weather. Something unfortunate but unavoidable, never mentioning the hands responsible for creating the storm. She deleted the message without listening to the voicemail. Then another notification appeared. Federal investigators requesting formal cooperation. Her stomach tightened instantly. The apartment suddenly felt smaller around her, colder. She walked toward the window, trying to steady her breathing. Across the street, an older woman watered flowers outside a small grocery store, while two kids raced bicycles through puddles left behind by last night's rain. Normal life continued. It always did, even while somebody else's world collapsed quietly in the background. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. She had spent 15 years building Hayes Global into one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast. She survived hostile takeovers, brutal negotiations, public scrutiny, endless competition. Yet somehow the thing finally breaking her was betrayal from the one person she trusted enough to stand beside her. The front door opened softly 20 minutes later. Caleb stepped back inside alone, carrying 2 coffees in a cardboard tray. Forgot my keys, he said automatically before stopping when he saw her face. His expression changed immediately. Alert again. Careful. What happened? Victoria lowered the phone slowly. Federal investigators are involved now. Caleb set the coffees down quietly on the kitchen counter. No panic, no dramatic reaction, just attention. The kind, steady people gave during emergencies. Did you do what they say you did? He asked calmly. Victoria looked at him sharply. Most people soften questions like that around powerful women. Caleb did not. She respected him for it immediately. No, she answered honestly. Caleb held her gaze for one long second, measuring something deeper than words. Then he nodded once. Okay. Victoria blinked at him. That is it? That is enough for now. He slid one of the coffee cups toward her across the counter. Truth matters, he said quietly. But timing matters too. Panicked people make expensive mistakes. Victoria stared at him over the rising steam from the coffee cup. Former Navy SEAL, waiter, single father, calm in crisis. Suddenly she realized something unsettling. Caleb Brooks did not sound like a man guessing his way through pressure. He sounded like someone who had survived much worse than public humiliation. Caleb stayed only long enough to make sure Victoria's hands stopped shaking around the coffee cup. Then he grabbed his keys from the counter and slipped his jacket back on with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. You are leaving? Victoria asked, before she could stop herself. Caleb glanced toward the clock near the stove. Lunch shift starts at 11. Right. The word came out softer than she intended. Strange. 24 hours ago, she had entire teams waiting outside conference rooms for her arrival. Now, part of her did not want a waiter from Queens to walk out the front door. Caleb noticed something change in her expression. He always noticed, "You can stay here today," he said calmly. "There is leftover soup in the fridge. Maya gets home around 3:30. Victoria looked at him carefully. "You trust me in your apartment?" Caleb slid his wallet into his jacket pocket. "You slept beside a 7-year-old stuffed rabbit all night and cried during pancakes." One corner of his mouth lifted faintly. "I think my television is safe." Victoria actually laughed this time. Short, real. Caleb watched the sound reach her before his expression softened slightly again. "You should rest," he added quietly. "People think survival is about staying strong all the time. Usually it is about staying clear long enough to make the next good decision." Victoria studied him for a long moment. After that, "You really do not talk like a waiter." Caleb opened the apartment door halfway before answering. "And you do not talk like someone who steals federal money." Then he left. The apartment grew still again, once the door clicked shut behind him. Victoria remained at the kitchen counter, staring into her coffee for several seconds. His words stayed with her longer than they should have. Most people spoke around power. Caleb spoke through it. By noon, rain had finally stopped outside. Weak sunlight drifted through the apartment windows while Queens hummed quietly beyond the glass. Victoria changed into a borrowed sweatshirt from the donation box Caleb mentioned earlier. Gray, oversized, soft from too many washes. She caught her reflection briefly in the hallway mirror and almost did not recognize herself. No designer heels, no perfect makeup, no armor, just a tired woman standing barefoot in somebody else's apartment trying to remember who she was without money attached to her name. Her phone remained silent for almost 20 minutes before ringing again. "Richard." "This time," she answered. "Victoria," his voice came quickly, polished as ever. "Thank God." She said nothing. Richard exhaled sharply on the other end. "Listen carefully. Investigators are asking questions about offshore transfers. We need to stay aligned on this." "We." Funny word. "Aligned?" Victoria repeated quietly. "That is what you are calling this now? Do not do that." His tone tightened immediately. "You know how these things work. Somebody has to absorb public responsibility while legal sorts out the details." Victoria walked slowly toward the apartment window. Below, an old man pushed a fruit cart down the sidewalk, while two women argued cheerfully outside a laundromat. Normal life. Honest life. "You told the board I approved those transfers," she said softly. Silence answered first. Then came Richard's measured voice again. It was the cleanest option available. Something cold moved through her chest then. Not heartbreak, clarity. "You promised me there was nothing illegal happening." "There was not supposed to be." Victoria closed her eyes briefly. There it was, the truth hidden inside careful language. Richard continued speaking, words rushing faster now. "Look, if you cooperate quietly, this blows over in 6 months. Maybe less. But if you start fighting publicly, people get ugly fast." Victoria looked around apartment 3B slowly while he talked. The child's drawings on the refrigerator, Caleb's neatly folded jacket hanging near the door. A repaired pink backpack waiting for school tomorrow. Simple things. Honest things. Suddenly, Richard's voice sounded very far away. "Victoria?" he pressed. "Are you listening?" She opened her eyes slowly. "No," she said quietly. "I think for the first time in years, I finally am not." Then she ended the call. Her hands trembled afterward. Not from fear this time, from release. She stood there breathing slowly, while afternoon light filled the apartment in soft gold. Nobody had ever taught Victoria Hayes how to lose power with dignity. But somewhere between burned pancakes, a child's stuffed rabbit, and a former Navy SEAL quietly rebuilding his life in Queens, she was beginning to understand something deeper than survival. Sometimes losing everything removed the noise long enough for you to hear the truth. By 3:30 that afternoon, apartment 3B smelled like tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. Victoria stood awkwardly beside the stove wearing Caleb's oversized sweatshirt while trying not to burn bread for the second time in one day. She heard Maya before she saw her. Fast footsteps racing down the hallway outside. Then the apartment door burst open with all the force and energy only children seem capable of carrying naturally. "Daddy said you might still be here," Maya announced breathlessly while dropping her backpack beside the couch. She stopped suddenly and sniffed the air. Oh no, Victoria blinked. What? Maya pointed dramatically toward the frying pan. You burned the grilled cheese. Victoria stared at the sandwich for a second before laughing helplessly. Apparently I did. Maya climbed onto one of the kitchen stools and watched her carefully. Daddy burns pancakes when he is thinking too much. She tilted her head slightly. Maybe you are thinking too much too. Victoria looked down at the blackened sandwich in the pan. Funny. A child in Queens understood her emotional state better than half the executives she spent 15 years working beside. Probably, she admitted quietly. Maya nodded like that made perfect sense. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper covered in gold stars. I got a 98 on my science quiz, she announced proudly. Victoria smiled immediately. That is amazing, Maya grinned. Daddy says almost perfect still counts as excellent. Victoria felt something tighten unexpectedly in her chest again. Caleb kept leaving pieces of himself everywhere in this apartment. Not physically, emotionally, in the way Maya spoke, in the way she carried kindness so naturally, in the way peace seemed built into the walls here instead of purchased like furniture. The front door opened again 20 minutes later. Caleb stepped inside carrying 2 grocery bags and stopped short when he saw Victoria and Maya sitting cross-legged on the living room floor surrounded by crayons and construction paper. Maya immediately held up her science quiz triumphantly. 98, she declared. Caleb set the groceries down and crouched beside her with genuine pride warming his tired face. That is my girl. Maya pointed toward Victoria. She burned lunch, but she is emotionally improving. Caleb blinked once before looking toward Victoria. She laughed quietly while covering part of her face with one hand. I am being judged by a 3rd grader. 2nd grader, Maya corrected seriously. Caleb shook his head with a low chuckle under his breath. Then his phone buzzed inside his pocket. The sound changed something in him instantly. Small, subtle, but Victoria saw it. He checked the screen briefly before his expression hardened into stillness again. Everything okay? She asked softly. Caleb slid the phone back into his pocket. Just work. But the answer came too fast. Too controlled. Victoria stood slowly from the floor. That was not a waiter face. Caleb looked at her for a long second, then away. One of the reporters from last night came into the restaurant asking questions. Maya's smile faded slightly at the change in tone. Caleb noticed immediately and softened his voice. Nothing to worry about, bug. But Victoria understood the problem instantly. Her chaos was reaching his life now. His job, his daughter, his peace. The realization sat heavy inside her chest. I should leave, she said quietly. Caleb looked at her sharply. Why? Because this follows me everywhere now. She gestured weakly toward the apartment around them. Reporters, investigators, headlines. You and Maya should not get dragged into that. Silence settled briefly across the room. Maya looked between them uncertainly while clutching her science paper against her chest. Caleb finally stepped closer, not invading her space, just near enough for his calm presence to reach her again. Victoria, he said quietly, bad people count on decent folks abandoning each other when things get difficult. She looked down at the floor. You barely know me. Maybe. His voice remained steady. But I know fear when I see it, and I know what it looks like when somebody is trying to carry shame that does not belong to them. The apartment fell still after that. Even Maya stayed quiet. Outside the window, evening sunlight faded slowly across Queens while traffic hummed through distant streets. Victoria looked up at Caleb then. Really looked at him. The former Navy SEAL turned waiter, standing inside a modest apartment, with grocery bags still resting by the door and a little girl coloring rockets on the floor behind him. A man who had every reason to protect only himself, yet somehow still chose kindness first. Her eyes softened slightly. Why are you helping me? She whispered. Caleb held her gaze without hesitation this time. Because somebody should, and for the first time since her entire world collapsed, Victoria Hayes felt something stronger than fear begin quietly returning to life inside her. Hope.